Bon matin. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Good, good morning, everyone. We are looking forward to this exciting webinar on day one of the CAPI webinar series, More and Better with Less, Sustainable Intensification in Agriculture, presented by our co-sponsors AgWest Bio and the Global Institute for Food Security. My name is Tyler McCann, and I am the Chief Engagement Officer at CAPI. L'ICPA est un institut qui dirige, catalyse et coordonne des analyses stratégiques indépendantes sur les nouveaux enjeux agroalimentaires, engage le dialogue avec les intervenants et fait progresser les politiques publiques. CAPI focuses solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to the agri-food policymakers by creating venues for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. A great way to be involved with CAPI is to become a partner or supporter of the work accomplished through our registered charity, the Canadian Agri-Food Foundation, which supports the work of CAPI. Your commitment is vital as it is urgent to intensify our efforts as agriculture and agri-food can be essential solution providers for the economy, environment, health, food, and global security, but creative policy changes are essential. Connect through the info email located at the bottom right of the screen. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for today's webinar, AgWest Bio and the Global Institute for Food Security, and I would like to invite Steve Webb, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer at the Global Institute for Food Security and Chair of AgWest Bio's Board of Directors, to say a few words.
Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, where everybody is. Welcome. My name is Steve Webb. Thank you, Tyler, for that introduction. And as he mentioned, I represent both AgWest as the chair of the board, and I am the CEO of the Global Institute for Food Security. Canadian agriculture and food is more than $100 billion industry in Canada, roughly 10% of the national economy and 10% of Canada's employment. And it's been growing faster. And it's projected to add significantly to our country's economic output in the coming years. That was an article from the National Post. And again, those statistics don't lie. Canada needs agriculture and food to meet both its economic and environmental goals. CAPI is facilitating these conversations and webinars, which I think are absolutely critical. I like the phrase that Ted has used for Canadian agriculture, realizing sustainable intensification. And see, Ted, I told you I'd take that line and use it wherever I can. Agriculture and agri-food is a key part of the solution for Canada to realize both its economic growth and meet our country's international climate commitments. Both AgWest and GIFS share a belief that innovation is key to enabling economic, environmentally, and socially sustainable food production. So thanks for the opportunity to sponsor this first day, and I look forward to the rest of the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks again to today's co-sponsors, AgWest Bio and the Global Institute for Food Security. Before we officially begin today's program, and I pass things over to our moderator, we have a few housekeeping items to review. During the webinar, participant audio and video will be turned off. As an attendee, you cannot be seen or heard by others. Participants can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. Due to time limits, the moderator may not be able to ask all questions submitted, but we do encourage you to submit your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all participants and posted on our YouTube channel. If you are posting about this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag #MoreBetterLess. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for day one of More and Better with Less, the CAPI webinar series, Dr. Susan Wood-Bohm, President and CEO of Wood-Bohm and Associates. Dr. Susan Wood-Bohm provides strategic consulting services to industry and government in the areas of innovation, research and development, investment, and integrated solutions deployment in the agriculture sector. Susan has over 30 years of experience in academia, government, and industry, and a lifetime on the farm. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Tyler, and good morning to all. I am very pleased to be the moderator for this part of the webinar series on sustainable intensification. And at this morning's webinar, we will hear from 3 distinguished speakers in this order. We'll start with Dr. Tim Searchinger, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Policy Research and on Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Tim McAllister, Principal Research Scientist in Ruminant Nutrition and Microbiology at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge, Alberta. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Richard Gray, Canadian Grain Policy Research Chair and Professor at the University of Saskatchewan. I will be offering you a 2-minute warning, gentlemen, as you get close to the end of your presentation. So if you hear a little voice peek in there, that's just me. And without any further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our first speaker and welcome Dr. Tim Searchinger. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to speak here. It's a very exciting day because I actually have put on a jacket for the first time in months working from home. And can you all see my screen now? It's with the World Resources Report. Does it show that?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. I'm going to put it on play. Let's take from the start, and there we go. So I was the lead author of a lengthy report for the World Bank, the UN, and the World Resources Institute in 2019 that basically addressed the question of how do we feed the world in 2050 while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, basically without destroying the world. And I'm going to focus here on greenhouse gas emissions because I think that's the focus. And right now, today, agriculture is responsible for about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's this 12 number here. And the global emissions are about 50 billion tons. Agriculture is about 12. And the challenge is that we need a lot more food. We're going to, what is going on here? Okay, there we go. I know, I'm sorry. What are those emissions? So those emissions are first land use change. Agriculture already occupies about half of the world's vegetated land and even more of the land that's not in kind of the boreal forest areas. And we continue to convert forest land and savannas to produce more food. Here you see conversion in the Amazon for beef, oil palm conversion in Indonesia on the right. From a production emission standpoint, so that's about 5 billion tons. And we also have production emissions of almost 7 billion tons. And here's what you see the categories. It's not rocket science in a way. There are a limited number of categories. This is nitrogen use. This is rice methane, which is overwhelmingly in Asia. Almost half of the emissions, however, come from ruminant livestock. Basically cattle, sheep, and goats. Here's the digestion emissions, waste on pastures, and about half of the manure management emissions. And overall, livestock are about 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. And energy, we think of energy emissions, but energy is only about 1/4 of the emissions in the agricultural sector. Now, the challenge is that we need to produce a lot more food. The population is going to go up to about 10 billion people by 2050. And even more of those people are going to have decent incomes so they can eat better. Today, an amazing number of people in the world eat a very poor diet with very limited amounts of meat, but even limited amounts of vegetables and vegetable oil. And the meat consumption as a result is going to rise like crazy. So we're estimating, this is for 2010 to 2050, about a 70% increase in animal product consumption. It's going up at this path. We estimate, based on FAO numbers, about a 70% increase in ruminant meat consumption too. That's not quite going up quite at that rate. Now, as a result of that, even if agriculture continues to make the same kind of productivity gains as it's done since 1960 at the same rate, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture will go up to about 15 billion tons. Now, to solve climate change, this is probably now an overestimate. The maximum emissions from all human sources in 2050 are at most 21 billion tons, probably more like 20 or even 17. For agriculture to do its fair share, total agricultural emissions should be about 4. And what that means is we have to produce about 50% more food with 1/3 of the emissions. And including that, that means converting no more agricultural land, no more land. We have to produce all that additional food on the same land. And then on top of that, we have to reduce production emissions by more than half. So we came up with, I won't go through this, we came up with a multi-part strategy, we call it a multi-course menu of items. And it includes reducing growth and demand, increasing productivity, reducing emissions. Let me summarize it for you. We have now kind of a new term. It's produce, protect, reduce, and restore. Produce more food on the same land, use that to protect forests and other habitat from being converted, which has to be done explicitly, reduce demand for land and reduce production emissions, and then selectively restore areas where we can. Now, let me focus on why producing more food in the same land is so important and productivity gains are so important. These are our emissions today. If we tried to produce all the food we're going to need in 2050 with the same farms that we have today, greenhouse gas emissions would rise to about 36 billion tons. Remember, our target is 4. All human sources are about 20. Agriculture by itself would emit roughly twice the emissions allowable from all human sources if we just use the farms today with present yields, present livestock efficiencies. And a lot of that would be converting more forests. We basically convert almost all the world's remaining temperate and tropical forests. So increasing yields is absolutely critical. And we assume a lot of that, even our 15 billion tons, we're assuming rates of yield gain and productivity growth at roughly the last 50 years would continue. But that's harder because we need actually more rapid yield growth, but I'm sorry, geez, I've lost some of my lines here, but the real problem is that a lot of the things that we've relied on to increase yields, we can't do anymore. Irrigation is basically, we can't really irrigate any more land in the world. We've pretty much used up the water. In 1960, most of the world, very little of the world used synthetic fertilizer. Now, outside of Africa, almost everybody does. Most farmers didn't use, very few farmers use scientifically bred seeds. Today, outside of Africa, almost everyone does. So we have to essentially, we no longer have these easy ways to increase yields. We basically have to do everything smarter. So improved crop breeding is a critical component of that. We should be putting a lot more resources into that. We have a wide variety of new molecular methods to do that with and without genetic engineering. That's one opportunity. Improving the efficiency with which we raise livestock is also critical. Now, this is a map that shows you the different emissions from producing beef in different parts of the world. And basically, it differs by a factor of more than 50, really more than 100. If you don't feed cows well with good high energy feeds, if you don't care for them well, you end up with massive emissions. So one of the opportunities, particularly in the developing world, is to improve the efficiency, the feeding quality, better caring of animals, including through just improved grazing, not just through feedlots. But I'm also doing a project on how Danish agriculture can go carbon neutral. And there really is nothing more important than continuing to reduce the amount of feed per animal. That results in less land use demands, less nitrogen fertilizer, less manure. It has a huge range of benefits. And the challenge is, how can we keep doing that, including for pork and dairy, in a humane way, including, for example, focusing on residual feed intake. We think there are opportunities to continue to do that, but that's continues to be really important. But we also need to curb our demand. This is the reduced part. And so even though the world is going to demand more beef, it is the reality that emissions per unit of beef, per kilogram of beef, dwarf those even from dairy and other meats. And all meats dwarf those from eating things like lentils or any kind of vegetable product. So we have a dramatically more land use. This is basically because it takes about 50 kilograms of feed to produce 1 kilogram of beef, even in the kind of developed countries. And while we have native grazing land, 1/3 of the world's grazing land was converted from forest, and that's where we continue to produce more for beef. To give you an idea, in the US, all of this red is basically beef. So half of the emissions, half of the land use, and the greenhouse gas emissions from land use are more important. They all come from beef, even though it supplies only 3% of our calories. So we have to, we need to produce beef more efficiently, and I think the next speaker is going to talk about ways of continuing to do that. If you're in the beef production business, we need you to continue to produce beef efficiently. It's not like beef consumption isn't going to continue to rise, but we need to hold down that amount. Now, a critical concept is the importance of valuing land properly. The basic story is we need 50% more food. We need more forests, not less. We need more forestry products. We cannot solve climate change if we convert more forest to agricultural land. And yet we have a fixed amount of land. And that means every hectare of land has a real value. That means we can produce more food on the same land. That saves carbon, that saves forests from being converted. On the other hand, if we expand into forests, we lose that. If we reduce our demand, every hectare, you should think of every hectare of land as having a carbon value by itself. And that means we also don't want an increased demand for land. It means, for example, that we do have opportunities to improve livestock grazing. It's enormously valuable. The value of improved livestock grazing, and this is a silvopastoral system in Colombia, the enormous value of improved grazing systems is that it allows us to produce more food on the same land and therefore save forests. And when you count it up, that's the huge greenhouse gas savings. So while improved grazing is critical, I'm giving you just a tropical example. There are examples in Canada too, of course. What we don't want to do is convert cropland to grazing land. So this is, some of the ideas of, quote, regenerative agriculture are to take cropland and convert it to grazing land. And it's true that doing that will actually sequester carbon in soils if you could take cropland out of production and turn it into grazing land. But basically, we get 10 to 15 times more food for each hectare of cropland than we do from grazing land. So we're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to feed the world without converting more land by taking our cropland out of production and turning it into grazing land. There may be particular areas where the cropping is particularly inefficient, where that makes sense, but as a general rule, that's not something we want to do. And this also puts in perspective the issue of kind of how much we can get out of soil carbon versus other things. So we are losing 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year from continuing to clear land around the world and from the degradation of peatlands, drained peatlands. And that is the real soil carbon and vegetative carbon that we want to save. So cover crops are enormously valuable practice, particularly for water quality concerns. Right now, cover crops are used in about 4% of the US. If 100% of the US, of the lands in the US that could use cover crops, use them, that might sequester maybe 100 million tons of carbon per hectare, 100 million tons per year. Now, even today, even in the US, we are continuing to convert native prairie in the Great Plains at a cost of 140 million tons per year. So if we got every farm that could using cover crops, we would not sequester as much carbon as we are losing just by converting a much smaller area of native grass to prairie every year, to cropland every year. And this is an example of why we need to protect too. Even in the US, where we basically are no longer clearing land at the same rate. Of course, we massively cleared land in the 1900s, in the 1900s and the 1800s in particular. But even now, we're converting land. We have to stop doing that. And when this is also, I'm just going to say one thing about bioenergy. if you need 50% more food, and we need more forests, and we need to preserve our savannas, which have a lot of carbon too, and somebody says, look, the solution to that is we're going to take the best agricultural land in the world, and we're going to use it for energy. You say, what? Don't we need that land for these other purposes? And it turns out that using land to make energy is extraordinarily inefficient. So basically, both solar cells and ethanol biofuels take the energy from the sun and turn it into usable energy. But Iowa cornland converts about 0.1% of the energy in the sun into usable energy. It's more like 0.15%. Sugarcane ethanol, the best, 0.2%. And a photovoltaic cell can do 20% right now. And not only that, we don't need to use the best agricultural land in the world to produce energy using photovoltaic cells. So basically, bioenergy is not the solution. It requires a massive amount of land to make a very small amount of energy, and we need our land for other purposes. So last thing, I think I'm going to begin to run out of time. Let me see how my time is. Yeah, let me just say that what can we do then? We need to focus on increasing productivity in every way we can through crop breeding and continued livestock improvements, but that's still not going to be enough. We need to reduce these production emissions as well. And the basic story is we have a lot of really good ideas about how to do that, but we're not really able to do that right now. What we have to do is rapidly develop these ideas, and in some cases very quickly, in a few years, and in some cases it may take more, in order to actually be able to reduce those emissions. And that's not a strange concept. Agriculture is kind of where we were in the energy sector 25 years ago, 20 years ago, before anyone, we had solar cells, we had wind, we had bad batteries, and in the last 25 years, through a lot of hard work, we've improved those. We're still going to need a lot of innovation in the energy sector. The same is true in the agricultural sector. So this is a feed additive that the company DSM has developed that will probably be approved in Europe this year, that looks like it reduces emissions from enteric fermentation by 40 to 50%, and at least in dairy cows improves milk fat. So it can basically pay for itself, we hope. How do we make better use of nitrogen? Well, this is just a map of precision agriculture, but I'll tell you the part of this that excites me. So just applying nitrogen more efficiently at the same time can only get you so much by kind of across the fields. But soils, I mean, crops only need most of their nitrogen many weeks, several weeks after planting, as you know. And during that time, after planting and before the crops need it, as you all know, a lot of nitrogen is coming out of the soils. But we don't really know how much because it varies from year to year. But if we use precision agriculture to wait, for example, 6 weeks or so after corn planting in the US, something like that, and then assess the amount of nitrogen that's come out of the soils, the evidence is that we can often apply 30% less nitrogen. This is an exciting idea in Denmark, where replacing silage maize, the idea is to plant a high-yielding grass or grass clover mix, and then press the grass so that out of it comes a combination of a fiber that is even more digestible and better than silage maize. And then 20% of it is a high-protein liquid that can actually be used to consolidate it and turned into replacing soybeans. And you end up with a high protein feed, and you have the same amount or more fodder for your cattle, and you basically get more food per hectare, and you can replace an annual crop with a perennial crop that should help to sequester some carbon, will leach less, use less nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera. This is a really exciting idea. Wherever people really focus on emissions, they discover that a huge percentage of their emissions comes from drained peatlands. And I don't really know what the situation is in Canada, but once you take a peatland and you drain it for agriculture, you get massive emissions. So a major focus in Denmark, for example, is to restore peatlands. And they're globally, drained peatlands contribute about 2% of all emissions, and they occupy only 0.5% of global agricultural land. Here's a really exciting idea. You can buy this now in the US, and it is a nitrogen-fixing bacterium. And sugarcane, as many of you know, sugarcane is one of the few non-leguminous crops that actually fixes a lot of its own nitrogen. A scientist in England has spent most of his career trying to figure out how you can identify the key microbe bacterium that does that and get that into other crops. They've been able to do that in the lab with a huge range of crops. It's a bacterium called GD. It fixes quite a lot of nitrogen. They've been able to get higher yields of applying even 25% less nitrogen. And one reason is the bacterium gets right into the chloroplast of the leaf and fixes ammonium directly there. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of jump to the fact that it turns out that there's a good chance that adding ammonium to plants, to crops at particular times can boost yields by combining with nitrate. The last thing I'll say, just an example here, another opportunity, maybe a very cheap opportunity to deal with emissions from manure is to acidify the manure. And even that, there are some ideas that just adding a small amount of sulfate could actually dramatically reduce the amount of methane from manure. Then if you acidify right at the end and you apply it to your crop fields, I'm sure some of this is happening in Canada, you lose a lot less nitrogen in the form of ammonia losses. There's some evidence you get yield gains, some evidence you reduce nitrous oxide. So I'm just going to say, I think, how much time do I have? Am I out of time?
You are not out of time.
Okay, so then I have
you still have a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, a couple more things then. So one thing we have to do is we have to use the funding that we provide to agriculture so that it helps us achieve these goals. So I had a report with the World Bank, I think it was last year, that we analyzed global financial support to agriculture. And you won't be surprised to discover that very little of that money actually goes toward kind of achieving environmental goals. And even a surprising amount, very little really goes to even boosting productivity. So things like infrastructure support or research and technical assistance. Here's the conservation. And then most of the conservation money as well, we analyzed how much kind of the money that was being spent on conservation, how much of that really contributed to solving climate change. And the answer was not much. So here's kind of, again, the conservation amount. And even viewed very, very broadly, very little of that money was going toward advancing any of these solutions that I was talking about in terms of solving climate change. So one of the things we need to do is use some of that money better. And I will sum it up this way. So first, the way to solve the climate change challenge with agriculture, not surprisingly, is to focus on where the emissions are. It's like, why did Jesse J or whoever it was, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So you want to solve the emission problem, you focus on where the emissions are. So this means we need to be very specific about that, right? We're trying to solve enteric fermentation, we're trying to solve manure. If we are guided by real science and real numbers, it will drive our efforts well. I've summarized this basic points about produce, protect, reduce, and restore. Produce more food on the same land, use that to protect habitat and carbon stores, even in the Northern Hemisphere, where we're still converting land, surprisingly, but even more in the tropics. Use that to do what we can to reduce our demand for land. And this key concept, if we don't value land for its carbon value, you have very perverted incentives. So I gave you the example of where somebody says, well, look, we can actually reduce emissions by taking cropland out of production and turning it into grazing land. Well, we can do that because that will absorb carbon. But produce so much less food that can't be part of the solution. And if you think about the fact that you then need dramatically more land to produce the same amount of food, and that means we have to convert more land around the world, there are enormous carbon costs to doing that. And similarly, when we increase productivity of land, we need to recognize the value of that in terms of the amount of land that we can save. So it's important to actually value each hectare of land as having an opportunity cost, having a real carbon value, just the way we value anything else. So that has to be built into policy. And I have methods, there are other people who suggested methods, I have methods for doing that. The last thing I'm going to say is this: we need to focus on these innovative opportunities. If you take a step back and you say, geez, you really want to produce more than 50% more food, and you have to do it without clearing any more land, and you have to do it with 1/3 of the emissions, you say, that's crazy. You come on, just give it up. But in the course of doing this report that we're going to be coming out with on Denmark, I had a chance to look more at the innovations that are available or people are talking about. And they're very exciting. And basically, with pretty small amounts of incentives, scientists, farmers, entrepreneurs have been identifying promising ideas to deal with almost every type of emission. And what we need is to put real money into what I call collaborative projects, projects where farmers, scientists, the private sector are working together to explore how to do things. And the way to think about that is this. I'll just say, and I'll end on this note. When Apple said, we want to build an iPhone, it had a huge range of technical problems, right? It needed to have screens that would work much better with less energy, it wouldn't break. You needed to have batteries that would be better. It needed to have software. And at the time I started thinking about it, none of these, it couldn't be done. And so, like any other good company, it develops different component teams that systematically try to figure out how to solve each of those problems. And that's the way we should be doing this in the agricultural sector too. Right now, what we do is we get a research project, it gets written up, somebody thinks about it, a year later, somebody decides whether to fund another research project, follows up on that. That is not the way, the pace at which we need to go to solve these challenges. We need to have teams working collaboratively for each of these sources of emissions, each of these challenges, to try to advance them as rapidly as possible. And so that, if I were going to give one advice to Canada to now try to deal with climate change, Canada has a very advanced agricultural sector, as you know. That means its emissions per unit of food are relatively low compared to the rest of the world as a whole. And that means Canadian agriculture is very valuable. But even so, we can't solve the problem unless we make still a lot of improvements. And the idea is to formulate different teams, put real money into it, and solve each one of these different types of problems. And I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. You've really set the stage for us, helping us to understand the magnitude of the challenge that we face, and also some very innovative approaches to dealing with that. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Tim McAllister and ask him if he will offer us his perspectives. Tim?
Thanks very much. I just need to share my screen here. Can you see that okay? Susan? Good. Okay, thanks very much. It's a great honor to give a presentation on some of the work that we've done and also share some of the Canadian perspective in livestock production. I think Tim has really set the stage, as was mentioned, in terms of some of the challenges we're facing and dealing with climate change, meeting those climate change targets, and the critical role that agriculture can play within them. So a lot of that has to do then with the role of innovation in lowering the greenhouse gas intensity and what I call the environmental footprint of Canadian beef and dairy production. And many of the concepts that I am going to share here would also apply in different management strategies to poultry and swine production in Canada as well. We've already heard how important the beef and dairy industry is, or agriculture is, to Canada. Hopefully I can get my slides to advance here. There we go. So there's about 60,000 beef farms in Canada, generating about 33 billion per year to the Canadian economy. Our herd is, compared to the United States, is relatively small. We're about 10 times smaller than what the US is. But we are significant on the world stage in terms as a global beef exporter, about 6th largest globally. And in 2019, we were around 1.2 million tons of beef that we produced in Canada. Same with our dairy industry. As you know, our dairy industry is supply controlled, but it generates 6.6 billion for the Canadian farms, about 14.3 billion in milk and milk products. And we also are well recognized for the genetics within our dairy herds, which are also exported internationally as well. There's considerable infrastructure in terms of the farms, the dairy plants, and an increase in the use of robotic milking, and also the role that these both ruminant production systems play in terms of maintaining our rural communities and keeping people on the land, and the movement that we've seen from people from the rural economy into the urbanized sector. Now, we've also heard a lot of negativity in the press with regard to ruminant production and the implications it has for climate change, land use change, etc. Often those messages are coming from groups that have their own vested interests, and often the points that are made are frequently exaggerated, and they're often narrow in scope as well. They don't look at the integration between livestock and cropping systems. So a lot of our work has been focusing on knowing the facts from the fiction. So basically separating out those points that are science-based from those that have other reasons for being made, understand the dynamics and the interrelationships. Really what we're talking about here in most agricultural systems is trade-offs. There's no one system that's perfect, and it really involves getting a balance between those trade-offs. And then the objective is to really empower the public to make informed decisions. So if they want to go vegan, they're making that with an understanding of the implications that has for the entire agricultural system and the ecosystem services that it delivers. Now, the beef and dairy industry in Canada, one of the important things is that it manages vast quantities of land, about 50 million acres of pasture land in Canada. Those grassland systems protect marginal lands from tillage and erosion. So I would call that precision land use. So we need to maintain those grasslands in areas that are not suitable for crop production. And then, as Tim pointed out, we need to use those regions that are to produce the crops that we need to feed people and the livestock. These areas also are really important in terms of carbon sequestration and storage, and they provide habitat and promote biodiversity as well. And then we have to keep in mind too that ruminants are unique in terms of their ability to convert those inedible forages that are not consumable or utilizable by monogastric animals or humans like ourselves into high quality protein in the form of milk and meat that can be an important part of the human diet. So when you look at the implications then of the footprint, that it has implications both for the beef and the dairy industry. So we can make management recommendations that improve efficiencies and lower greenhouse gas emissions and improve the efficiency of product yield per unit of input. It also has important implications for technology developers. We've seen investment in areas of methane mitigation, as Tim pointed out, the 3-nitroxypropanol product that's been developed by DSM. It also has implications for beef and dairy product consumers, so they know the impacts of the production practices on the land and from the perspective of climate change. And then it also has implications for even vegetarians and vegans in terms of the decisions that they're making in terms of just consuming non-animal products. So in the components of the footprint, Tim focused on greenhouse gases and climate change, but I'm going to broaden that a little bit more, because I think when we look at livestock or agricultural production systems, we have to consider all factors that contribute to sustainability. So greenhouse gas and climate change is an important part of that. So is carbon sequestration and land use change. But we also need to think about the water footprint or water use, implications for biodiversity and ecosystem services as well, of which economic sustainability is one of those ecosystem services as well. And probably the one that producers often have to focus on mainly, because ultimately they have to generate a livelihood from the agricultural practices that they're carrying out. So what is the carbon footprint? So the carbon footprint is really just a measurement of the greenhouse gases that are associated with the livestock production system. Consists of 3 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Those greenhouse gases differ in their global warming potential. The global warming potential of methane is about 25 to 28 times that of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is about 265 to 300 times that of carbon dioxide. So that basically means that 1 molecule of methane is equal to about 28 molecules of CO2 in terms of its contribution to the global warming effect. So what we did then is we did a comparison to illustrate, well, what is the level of efficiency that's taken place within the Canadian beef industry from 1981 to 2011. And in order to do that, we measured or estimated all the greenhouse gases that were produced from that beef production sector, the number of animals and the land required to produce that amount of beef between those 2 years. And we selected those 2 years because that represents the census years within the Canadian Census Program. And we needed that information in terms of livestock populations in order to make those estimates. Now, the Canadian beef production system actually has quite a complex footprint because there's several components to the beef cycle. The cow-calf sector is where we maintain the cows and the calves out on pasture lands or forages, where about 80% of the diet consists of forage. So that would be considered the extensive phase of the beef production cycle. We also then have the feedlot sector, where we have calf-fed finishing, where calves are weaned and immediately put on a finishing diet. They're finished within about a 16-month period. We have another group of calves that go through what we call a background and a finishing stage, of which they're fed a higher forage diet during the backgrounding phase, and then a high energy grain diet in the finishing phase. Those take about 18 months to reach slaughter. And then we have the yearling fed, which are backgrounded in the feedlot, maintained over the winter, and then turned back out into the pasture during the spring. They stay on pasture until about August or so, and then they're brought into the feedlots for a shorter 40 to 60 day finishing period. Then those cattle would be about 20 months of age when they enter the processor. So the longer it takes for an animal to reach the phase of being suitable for processing, obviously the more greenhouse gas emissions that it's going to emit. And it's really this integrated system of beef cattle production that we have in Canada that makes our system so efficient relative to many other regions of the world. So we needed to consider the feed types, the feeding systems, the cattle classes and numbers, their average daily gains, their carcass weights, and then we estimated the greenhouse gas emissions using models that were developed by IPCC, and we have one that's Canadian orientated called HOLUS that was developed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And so what do we find? Well, we found to produce the same quantity of beef in Canada today versus 33 years ago, it required 29% fewer cattle in the breeding herd. It required 27% fewer cattle to go to slaughter in order to produce the same amount of beef. So it's a substantial improvement in efficiency. Beef produced in Canada requires about 24% less land than it did in 1981 compared to 2011. And footprint was about 15% lower in 2011 than it was in 1981. So we've also been working towards reducing the carbon footprint. Now, methane comprised 3/4 of that total greenhouse gas production per unit of beef, and over 78% of that was associated with the extensive portion of the cycle, which is the cow-calf sector. Many of that is related to the utilization of forages, and the efficiency of production of beef from forages is less than that from grains. And the integrated nature of our beef cattle production system in Canada, with a combination of both the forage system with the finishing feedlot system, is what leads to our efficiencies in terms of amongst the lowest greenhouse gas emissions in the world per kilogram of beef produced. Now, there are opportunities for mitigation in terms of improving forage quality and breeding. That's a big part of focusing on reducing methane in the cow-calf sector. It is challenging to administer additives, though, in the cow-calf sector. When the cattle are out on the extensive rangelands, obviously administering them a bolus or some sort of additive becomes quite challenging in that production setting. There are efforts to look at administering some of those through the mineral. Often mineral is provided to the cattle while they're out on pasture, but we find that the variability in mineral intakes amongst individual animals is also quite high, presenting a challenge of getting even distribution of an additive across the herd as a whole. So there's still, that's probably in terms of ruminant production globally, that's still one of the biggest challenges we face in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions in that sector. Now, we also looked at some of the other environmental indicators, one of which is ammonia. Ammonia is not a greenhouse gas, but it can be converted to nitrous oxide as well, and then it would become a greenhouse gas. And when we looked at the ammonia intensity per kilogram of beef between those years, we found about a 20% reduction in ammonia emissions per kilogram of beef produced as well. Likewise, with water, most people don't realize, but 95% of the water footprint associated with livestock production typically comes from the production of the feed. So you have to keep in mind that if that crop area was not used for the production of feed, it'd probably be used for the production of some other crop that would still be utilized to provide food for the human population. So removing livestock from the system is not going to cause that water use to disappear. Only about 5% of the water is used for the cattle directly in terms of water consumption, either in the cow-calf sector or in the feedlot, and in the processing, retail, and consumer sectors. So very low percentage of the total footprint is actually directly associated with the utilization of water by the livestock themselves. And with that, we found about a 17% reduction in water use intensity over that period of time as a result of improvements in efficiency in the beef industry. So where does that improvement come from? Some of it comes from reproductive efficiency. So that's the number of calves that are produced per cow. Canada has also amongst the highest reproductive efficiency rate of anywhere in the world in their beef cattle production system as well. The weaning weights have increased, the steer weight and heifer weights at slaughter have also increased. Those are the factors that are leading to the greatest improvements in efficiency. A lot of those are related to the enhanced nutrition that we're using, the improved diet formulation, the improvements in feed processing, the use of implants that dramatically improve the efficiency of the cattle. There is quite a bit of negativity to the worst of growth implants in beef cattle, but they're probably, in terms of additives, the most effective additives there are in terms of improving efficiency. They'll improve feed efficiency anywhere from 5 to 20%. So that means to produce the same kilogram of beef, you need 5 to 20% less feed. So that means less greenhouse gas emissions from crop production, because you don't need to produce as much feed to feed those animals. It means less greenhouse gas emissions from manure and nutrient excretion as well, because there's less manure that's generated in those animals as a result of the use of those implants as well. So if we're going to remove implants from the production system, we have to be aware that there's going to be an environmental cost and a production efficiency cost as a result of removing those technologies now that are highly effective in improving efficiency. And likewise, we've seen improvements on the crop side in terms of improvements in barley grain, barley silage yields. particularly in corn because of its hybrid nature and the investment from the private sector that goes into breeding new lines of corn. Dramatic improvements in corn yield, and corn yield continues to go up every year. There's a major push now in Canada to develop low heat unit corn, which can be grown in Canada's more northern climate. And we're seeing an expansion in the corn acreage across the prairies in Western Canada. Now, if we look at the dairy industry, we see similar patterns. The dairy agriculture, as I mentioned, only accounts for about 8% of Canada's total emissions. The dairy sector itself accounts for about 1.3% of that 8%. Globally, it's pretty insignificant. The distribution of those, like was mentioned earlier by Tim, a majority of that emissions come from the production of methane as a result of that fermentation. Now, the fermentation methane is a natural byproduct of the fermentation process produced by the archaea, and it's an important byproduct because it helps to improve the efficiency of feed digestion within the rumen. If we look at the efficiency of Canada's milk production, this just shows the global distribution of the amount of kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk. And you can see that Canada is way up here at the most efficient at 0.92 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk. The world average is about 2.5 kilograms, more than twice that of the efficiency of Canada. And we look at the reductions that have occurred. The dairy farmers of Canada funded a study that looked at the similar changes that I described for beef, which we conducted. And you can see that there was reductions in both the carbon footprint from 2011 to 2016, the amount of water consumption as well, and the amount of land use. The efficiency of production in dairy cows is also continuously increased. That's actually resulted in a continuous decline in the total dairy population within Canada because we are supply managed. We produce a constant amount of milk each year. And if one cow can produce more milk, then we need fewer cows nationally to produce that same amount of milk. And we've seen that trend. And so the emissions associated with the dairy industry have been continuously declining for a number of years due to the increase in cow efficiency. Now, where we have seen an increase in emissions from agriculture relatively recently is related to the point that Tim made about the continued conversion of grasslands into croplands. That leads to a huge release of that carbon as a result of the cultivation and the loss of that organic matter from those soils. And also when we convert those to croplands, then we're utilizing more chemical fertilizer, and that chemical fertilizer can lead to an increase in nitrous oxide emissions. So in Canada, actually the emission increases we've seen lately are coming from crop production, not from livestock production. So we've seen actually a reduction in methane emissions. Now, the other part I want to make is the importance of integration of livestock with cropping systems and their role in a circular economy. So livestock production is important because of the production of the manure that comes from as a result of the nutrients that are not digested by the livestock themselves. That manure is a rich source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and micronutrients. It is being used now to some extent in Canada for biorefinery and the generation of bioenergy. But that manure is also deposited on pasture land as well as on cropland. And unlike mineral fertilizer, it directly adds organic matter to the soils. So when we talk about soil health and rejuvenation of soils, manure can play a real key role in that process. Mineral fertilizer does not add organic matter to the soil. And in addition to that, it requires a substantial amount of fossil fuels under our current systems to produce that mineral fertilizer as well. So that the pasture lands and that have implications as well for soil quality from the perspective of lowering erosion control and the climate control because of the carbon sequestration. They also filter the water and result in improvements in water quality from groundwater and surface waters as well. The other point is when we look at the plant production, the grasslands and the crops, a lot of those crops are grown for human consumption. So if we look at wheat and barley, most farmers are originally planting those crops with the idea that they'll make the grade for flour in the case of wheat or for malting purposes in the case of barley. When those crops fail to make the grade for human consumption, they're then designated as livestock feed. Without the livestock in the system, that material that was failed to make the grade would essentially become virtually worthless, could potentially be used in biorefinery, but the returns and the value added from using those grains, as Tim pointed out, both from a climate change perspective, as well as from a value added perspective, would be much less than what they are when we run them through a livestock system and produce meat and milk products. In addition to that, livestock produce many other products other than just meat and milk. There's over 250 other additional byproducts that arise as a result of the processing of livestock, leather, bone meal, a number of pharmaceuticals and other cosmetics, etc., are also derived from livestock production. And we've heard a lot about the use of culture-based meat and how that could also replace livestock production. But when we delve into that and we look at the intricacies of that, we'll see right now that the most efficient lab-based meat production systems involve a use of a called calf fetal serum, which requires a living animal to produce in order for that to go into the media to be used to grow that lab-based meat. So even lab-based meat production cannot completely dissociate itself from livestock production systems. So we really need to think about then the benefit and the nature of the integration between forage and ruminant systems. The grassland and forage lands are an important part of Canadian beef cattle production. And as I mentioned, it represents the vast majority of land that's used in livestock production. It contributes to plant biodiversity, wildlife habitat, watershed management, soil nutrient recycling, and erosion control. Those established lands can also prevent the invasion of invasive species, conserve that carbon, and reduction of fossil fuel energy. A lot of those lands also conserve a lot of our wetlands that are very important. There are a number of organizations in Canada like Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservatory, World Wildlife Fund that are working with livestock producers to preserve those wetlands and maintain them intact, both from the benefit of beef cattle production as well as the biodiversity that are present within those wetland ecosystems. As Tim mentioned as well, those wetland ecosystems represent very important stores of carbon, because that carbon is not as readily degraded within the anaerobic environments that many of those wetlands represent. And that carbon store, one of the big concerns we have in the boreal forest areas of northern Canada is the loss of the carbon stores that are within those peatlands. As we have climate change, we have increased severity of forest fires. If those peatlands dry out, fires within those peatlands can burn underground for literally years, representing the release of massive amounts of carbon. So those are some of the things we need to think about from a broader perspective. And of course, the biodiversity in our grassland ecosystems, all of which, as Tim mentioned, are quite threatened already in terms of the conversion of them to cropland systems. We need to preserve those ecosystems as they are. They're already the ecosystems that harbor many of Canada's greatest species at risk, like the sage grouse. We've seen declines in prairie songbirds, etc. There's a large amount of biodiversity there that depends on those grassland ecosystems. And then finally, we need to think about the broader ecosystem services that come as a result of the livestock playing a role in the production system, including the human economic health and social well-being. And there's a lot of aesthetic value as well associated with the sustenance of those grasslands. And we also have cultural aspects that fit in here from the perspective of the Western way of life and the history that's occurred with the role that beef cattle production and livestock production played in the settlement of the West and the establishment of the society that we benefit from today. So there are a number of different players coming to the table in terms of looking at sustainability, groups working together that previously would have probably rarely talked to each other. And I think this is one of the real positive moves we've seen, in that we've got a wide array of people that are sitting around the table with various expertise that work together to try to achieve this common goal of sustainability. A lot of that involves benchmarking, but it also involves deriving that expertise across the various sectors with an appreciation for the trade-offs that I described. We're always talking about trade-offs, and in order to understand those trade-offs to the fullest extent, we need a variety of expertise around the table to contribute so that no one nuance that would represent a barrier is overlooked in terms of obtaining sustainability. So there's a major movement now in Canada within the livestock sector in terms of identifying these sustainable criteria, generating the metrics to measure those, carrying out benchmarking exercises, and then auditing procedures to ensure that Canadian livestock production meets those sustainability criteria. And the innovation that's emitted in terms of precision nutrition, precision land use, the additives and efficiency that contribute to efficiency are all part of working towards those sustainable goals. So that's kind of what I had. Be happy to have any questions if there are some.
Actually, we're going to just get you to wait, Tim. But thank you so much for your presentation. Just a ton of information there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to turn over now to Dr. Richard Gray, and we'll get your presentation, and then we'll be able to ask our questions to all three of you, okay? So please, Richard, go ahead when you're ready. I'll give you a little 2-minute warning.
Okay. I'm just trying to, there we go. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. The main part of my talk is going to be talking about the accounting for respiratory CO2 and how that changes the look at the grain sector in Canada. But before I do that, I'm just trying to get my cursor to move. It seems to be really slow. Okay, I've got to click on the mouse. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about our family farm. I grew up on this farm, farmed with my father. My son currently farms, so my memory spans about 50 years on this farm. It's gone from 1,000 acres to about 3,900 acres. The area cropped has increased fourfold. The amount of labor is about the same. It produces about 10 times as much product as it did 50 years ago. In terms of the number of crops, it's gone from a wheat and barley basis to a wheat, canola, peas, lentils. We've grown hemp and other things, quinoa, but a much more diverse rotation in a 3-year rotation at least. Tillage summer fall has been eliminated entirely. In 1970, it would have made 70. It would have made up 45% of the area. Now it's none. There's been no tillage in that land since 1980. About 1988. The tractor hours that we put in, it used to be 800 hours a year on the main tillage tractor. Now it's 200 hours a year at the most, and that's basically just to seed the crop. The organic matter in 1970 was declining, largely because of the summer fallow, but also because it wasn't being cropped each year. That organic matter since has been increasing substantially, and the yields and the performance of those soils has increased with it, which provides a feedback of higher yields feeding into the increased soil organic matter. The nitrogen per acre back in 1970, it wasn't very much because we were mining the soil, we're mining that nitrogen out of the organic matter. Right now, we're at 0.35 tons per acre. I just wanted to have a look at that number because it isn't very much of a tonnage per acre if you think of all the carbon that's being sequestered in those grains. In terms of often big commercial farms get, and this is just an average commercial farm, both were pretty close to the median farm size in 1970, still are now. We've actually seen an increase in the number of wildlife species, largely because the farms have got larger and we spend very little time in a particular field in a particular year. So the livestock are more or less, or sorry, the wildlife are more or less on their own for most of that year, which makes a big difference. So I think that's why we've seen some of these more timid species come into the land that just wasn't there 50 years ago. Just to let you know, it isn't all a flat plain. We have some flat plain land, but we've also got land that looks like this that is part of the habitat that is being protected within that grain system. And this land will never be drained and it will not be cultivated. In terms of, okay, so So that's the background on my farm, but getting back to the talk today, there's an interesting quirk to the IPCC accounting system that we use in our national inventory. For the whole life, for your whole life, you've been busy breathing in oxygen, breathing out CO2. But none of this CO2 is included in our national accounts. Obviously, cattle, chicken, hogs respire a lot of CO2. None of this CO2 is included in any of the national inventory. Crops remove about 100, just in the grain alone, about 100 million tons of CO2 goes pulled out of the atmosphere, put into those grains. None of that, with the exception of a little bit that's sequestered in soils, is actually included in the national inventory of emissions. Does this matter for policy? The fact that we're not including respiratory CO2 in the IPC accounting framework? I'm going to try to convince you that it does in the next 15 minutes. And if I'm successful at that, we can talk more generally about policy. So again, CO2 emitted through human or animal respiration is not included in CO2, in global CO2 emissions. CO2 emission emitted from biofuels is not included in that balance. CO2 sequestered in above ground crops is not included. And obviously, from a national perspective, this is important. CO2 exported from Canada in the form of fossil fuels is not included in Canadian emissions. And the quantities are significant. A ton of grain, it's made up primarily of carbohydrates, and it's a protein. That's about 40% carbon. You add the two oxygen molecules to that, and you weigh that, and you end up with about 1.42 tons of CO2 per ton of grain, roughly. So there's a lot of carbon there's a lot of CO2 that gets pulled out of the atmosphere, sequestered into these grains. Because it's part of a carbon cycle, the IPCC says that let's just ignore the sequestration and the emissions, and it's all square. Because it's all part of a cycle, which is true. But that has significant consequences for our accounting system and national accounts when we think about the trade in carbon and the carbon dioxide. Trade matters in this case. Canada's national greenhouse gas inventory was filed in 2020. That includes numbers up to 218. It's broken down by province and subsector. I'm going to focus on the crop sector in Western Canada, largely because I think it's pretty unique. One, because of its focus on conservation tillage, the adoption of conservation tillage. Two, perhaps because it is a more arid area that it has perhaps less nitrous oxide emissions in other parts of the world. And three, it's part of the inventories reflect this. It's one part of the world where it's very clear that soil organic carbon is actually increasing, not decreasing. This is what emissions look like from Western Canada when you include the emissions that come from the energy use. You include subtract off the carbon that's sequestered in the soils, and you end up with an upward trend that looks like this. And part of this is land conversion that Tim talked about. There's some of that as well. So it's about 16 or 17 million tons. Let's call it 17 million tons in 2018. If you look at Western Canadian crop production, Tim talked about the need to feed the world. If we look at the annual growth rates, back in the 80s and 90s, we were around 1.5% a year. Since 2000 to 2010, we're at 2.7% a year. And this last decade, we're at 4.5% a year. A very significant uptrend in that production, which is obviously pretty important if you're looking for a part of the world that maybe can provide these feed demands. Maybe the food demands, this might be part of the world that can do that. The other thing I should point out is that the mix of crops has changed considerably. If you look back in the 80s and 90s, it's mainly a blue bar. Those are cereals. The dark blue area is canola, which again, very important energy dense crop, good for the protein, good for oil. And then the gray area is special crops, and those are primarily peas and lentils that can be consumed directly by humans. So the crop mix has changed a lot, and the food, if you like, the value of that grain has probably gone up over time as well. So it's certainly been a dramatic increase in output. What does that mean if we look at intensity, the amount of CO2 emissions per ton of grain produced? Very significant decrease over time if you take into account the higher volume of grains being produced. So it's really important to, if you're going to use intensity, and the title of this whole session about intensively producing, I think this shows that even if we use IPCC accounting and we take into account the increase in production, we see a decrease in emissions intensity. However, I would also argue the national inventories are too conservative in the carbon being sequestered in the soils. They've been pretty, whenever there's an uncertainty, they're pretty careful how they look at that. Overall, the crop sector shows an increase in emissions, but this number's falling under these flawed measurements. This is what the IPC or the national accounts suggest that the measurements are. These are emissions that are coming from the soil and burning of fossil fuels on the land. This is the net amount that's being sequestered. Some of that's increase in organic matter being offset by land conversion. Sorry, I've got to go back here. And so the net amount is that 17 million tons that we talked about in 2018. If we compare those numbers to the amount of carbon that's actually flowing through the grain, there's a significant, that you can see that the crop itself, just the grain part of the crop, not the straw, not the roots, there's a bunch more carbon there, but just the grain component in Western Canada is 89 million tons of carbon that goes into the grain kernels that are removed off that land. If we said, what is grain producing? If you said, put a bubble over those grain farms and said, what's happening over the atmosphere in those grain farms? There's 72 million tons of carbon being pulled out of the atmosphere at that point, if you put the bubble over those farms. But you also have to consider that a bunch of that grain doesn't stay on the farm, it goes other places, it's exported, and with the result that we end up with 46, but let's just talk about this for a minute. If we put a bubble over Canada and say how much carbon is this sector actually extracting from the atmosphere, including the grain that is being fed by livestock, how much is actually being put into the atmosphere by this sector? And we end up with 46 million tons being pulled out of the atmosphere annually by the grain sector. If we include the world, we get a different story. That's when we get to the 17 million tons of emissions, because this grain eventually when it's exported, the 62 million tons eventually re-enters the atmosphere as other countries use it as biofuels, or they use it as it's used in livestock feed, or it's used in human consumption. But it does re-enter the atmosphere. So you can say, well, we're back at 17, but the Canadian story is very different. That sector is pulling a lot out of the atmosphere, and recognizing that might have an impact on our policy. Is it a big number? Well, just rough numbers. And again, I was talking Western Canada, but let's talk about the Canadian grain sector for a minute. We produce about 100 million tons of grain in Canada, sequestering about 125 million tons of carbon. about half of this grain is used or consumed in Canada, going back to the atmosphere. So about 62 million tons gets emitted back into the atmosphere in Canada. The other 62 we export. Doesn't get emitted in Canada, gets exported somewhere else. Remember, I indicated earlier that if we export oil and coal, that doesn't count against Canadian emissions. Other countries are responsible for their emissions. But in the case the way we account for grains, or the way we account for respiratory CO2, we're in fact responsible for the emissions of who uses those grains in other parts of the world, which is a very different form of accounting. So we have two sets of books, if you like. Okay, so that 62 million tons is emitted in other countries. It re-enters the atmosphere in other countries. So on net, that means that the grain production in Canada, that's part basically sequesters 62, just happens to be about half. Again, if you're looking at an increase in exports, and this effect becomes larger over time as we export more of these grains, it's become more important. So the IPC view of the Canadian crop sector is we're an emitter, and it's about constant over time in the crop sector with some of but if we look at, if you like, take into account respiratory CO2, Canadian emissions look very, very different from this sector. It's actually sequestering a lot of carbon per year. And I guess if you've been on a grain farm and you walk around and look at the fertilizer bins, look at the size of those bins, look at the size of fuel tanks, and then look at the size of all the grain storage on that farm, you get an idea why you get that effect. There's an amazing amount of carbon that comes out of the atmosphere and into those grain bins that you're certainly not purchasing off farm. It's coming from the atmosphere onto the farm every year, and you're exporting that carbon off the farm. Some of it gets fed in Canada, some of it gets exported. This is Canada's national accounts. The official numbers, agriculture as a total, we're at 59. If you included the respiratory CO2 with my, I'm going to say, I'll admit they're crude estimates. I'd like to see better estimates. But by my calculations, you're at about -3 for Canadian agriculture. Very different picture. So there's enough being sequestered from grains to offset what the livestock is actually emitting. So in terms of implications, Canada as a grain exporter looks like a much larger emitter than it actually is, because we're exporting that carbon in grains. We're not emitting it. It's actually being sold as carbon, but we're getting charged with those emissions that take place other places. Similar, another country, for example, could import our grains, use it in biofuel, use it in other not produce grain themselves, and they would, if you like, have lower emissions than actually what they're actually emit. And I would also say, if you introduce respiratory CO2, livestock production looks like a smaller greenhouse gas emitter than it actually is. I think this goes back to Tim Serpent's comments about the efficiency of livestock production versus grains in terms of conversion to food. So in terms of policy implications, if the world price of grain does not reflect the sequestered value of carbon in grains, we might need to find other policies to encourage the sequestration of carbon into grain and discourage its use. It's coming out of the atmosphere. It's got value because it's got carbon in it. So just like we have to value carbon in land, we have to value carbon in these products as well. Current biofuel policies provide some of this incentive, but of course that creates other problems in the world in terms of creating this land scarcity and conversion that we're all talking about. The other thing I think is important is that if we do try to encourage grain production, it's really important to protect non-crop wildlife habitat and that conversion. Not only for, certainly carbon's important, but also the biodiversity. This is a chunk of our farm. And this is pretty important stuff to protect, and we need to actually have policies to do that. Right now, it's everybody can sort of appreciate this picture and appreciate that it exists. But if they're not paying for it, the farms have a commercial thing that they have to worry about. If this farm isn't, if my son isn't going to preserve that land and he sells it to someone else, they may decide to clear it. So I think it's really important to think about how do we preserve these habitats that are rich in carbon and wildlife habitat as well. It's not just grazing land that has wildlife habitat, by the way. So my worry is that policies to discourage fertilizer use might actually increase global greenhouse gas emissions. If we actually reduce grain production, reduce fertilizer, aggressively reduce fertilizer use in Canada and reduce grain production, that's going to be less carbon that we export. Other people are going to have to produce that carbon, and there'll be emissions other places. So I think it's important that we look at those policies in a better accounting framework. We have to be sure that faulty accounting does not create perverse policy incentives within a global trade environment. I think that's vital. And finally, most of my life I've spent on innovation policy. I would argue we can tinker around a little bit with prices on the edge, but most of this comes from innovation. If we're going to actually tackle climate change, we need to do things differently. We need to develop the science. We need to develop genetics. We need to develop the technologies that allow us to do that. And we need to keep our eye on the ball. And I certainly agree with the idea that we need a deliberate strategy to tackle this global problem that we all need to deal with. So with that, I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Richard. Some very interesting comments and reflections there. And I really do have to laugh when you showed us the picture of your hilly land in Saskatchewan. I'm in Ontario here in the hills of Dummer Township, and we can hardly keep the tractor from rolling down the hill. So we do have a number of questions coming in. You've sparked some really interesting debate, I'm sure. And as we get to examine these questions, and I'm going to reflect them out to you, I wondered if you could start with a little spot that you've all alluded to somewhere, and each take a moment and just reflect on how we build the collaborative environment that we have to have in terms of working with producers. There are innovations which are available and which could all help us, but we have to work with producers to get them in place, and they are a conservative group that are a little bit worried about adopting innovation because of the cost involved. And I just wondered if we could start with you, each taking a turn at addressing that, and then I'll come back to you with more questions. Dr. Serchin here, can you start with that one, please?
That's a great question. So maybe I can help contribute just in this way. The types of conservation projects that I think have been most effective are those that deliberately bring together a group of producers, technical advisors, and scientists to try out things and to kind of continue to tinker with it in a way and see how it works and learn from it. And they're, you know, in the U.S., there's a term for kind of most of the land return, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, but they're called partnership projects. In Europe, you saw some of those too. So this is where, at least when we have government funding, we can take some of the risk away from the farmer, right? I mean, because the funding, it's basically the risk is being borne by the government, and it allows us to kind of learn and play with things. So I think that is a good structure, at least for the government program side of things. And we, I mean, the other thing is to get the incentives right. And then we've had some discussions about that, and that's a broader system. But I'll leave it at that. I think that's a good model for the type of conservation project that we want. Let me just mention, actually, let me give you an example just in the context of cover crops, which I think are very valuable practice for some soil carbon, mainly water quality and other benefits. Right now, only a limited number of farms do cover crops, and there are challenges, right? There's, particularly I'm sure in Canada, limited time to get a cover crop in the ground, depending on what you've grown beforehand, probably the costs. So we need to, if we want cover crops to take off more, we need to improve the breeding of cover crops. We need to try different ways of getting them in the ground. Can we find ways to undersow cover crops that then emerge at the right time? There are different kind of techniques people have for mixing cover crops, planting them, whatever. So instead of just having an incentive program that says we're going to pay you to do cover crops, it's better to have a program that provides that incentive, but also has this kind of cooperative nature to look at exploring different ways of doing cover crops and figuring out and using that to advance the technology so that it eventually becomes self-sustaining.
Thank you for that. Tim McAllister, I'm going to fire the same question over to you. I know that things like the Global Roundtable certainly have a strong producer influence, and I'm wondering if you're seeing something different on the livestock side. So take a stab at the same question.
I think, Susan, most of the times it comes down to economics. Like I mentioned, these people are deriving their livelihood from the livestock production systems, and so they need to see value in the technologies. The greenhouse gas emissions, the methane mitigation. One of the points that have been used to promote those technologies is that if we lower methane emissions in the animal, then that energy will be redirected towards the production of meat and milk and improve efficiencies. And as a result, then there will be an economic incentive for the producers to adopt that technology. And that's really that's what's driving a lot of that. We're waiting for potential carbon markets to emerge and for there to be offsets and et cetera, which could be making some of those technologies more economically favorable if those systems come about. But in many other areas, like if we look at the beef cattle production, I think some of the aspects that are not immediately economically obvious are undervalued. So if we look at grassland ecosystems which were mentioned, at this point, we really attach no economic value to the biodiversity that those grasslands sustain. We don't really attach a value to the carbon that they store within the grassland ecosystems. And if the producer has environmental conditions that are favorable for crop production, and if they sit down and do the math, they can quickly figure out that if they cultivate that grassland up and if they can grow a suitable crop, they'll generate more revenue per acre than they would if they maintain it in a beef cattle production system. Mm-hmm. So we need to really recognize some of those gaps that occur that are just, basically economic incentives that go counteract, some of the steps and directions that we want to go in terms of sustainability. And we need to develop programs that will support those kinds of decision-making processes going in the right direction to meet our sustainable goals.
Mm-hmm. Richard, I saw you nodding while Tim was talking, and I wonder if you just want to add a few comments in there as well.
Sure. I would say certainly government has to have a role in this, certainly supporting basic research and other things. But I think if you look at the tremendous success of the conversion to the implementation of zero tillage, producers themselves had a huge role in that innovation. The Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association, the Indian Head Ag Research Foundation, the actual inventors of the air seeders and the seed placement, they were farmers. They very much worked together collaboratively to try to figure out and test these technologies and to share their successes. And they were posed with a problem: how do we prevent a decline in soil organic matter? That's all they were worried about. They were trying to save their soils. And they ended up creating a tremendous economic system that's allowed and paying dividends this decade that they never dreamt of. The original idea was, carbon's going to plateau in these soils. but they forgot to take into account that as they become more productive, they get more growth, and there's a feedback, positive feedback. And the producers have been very much involved in that. So going forward, I think it's a matter of governments should not forget producers. They should figure out how to involve them in directing and funding some of the research as well. Because it's the producers that are going to have to apply these technologies. And I think Tim's comments about cover crops is a good one too. That technology, not particularly suitable to dry Saskatchewan, where the second main crop is snow, but quite suitable to where, corn soybean systems. I mean, they need to cover those crops. In Saskatchewan, we don't have enough moisture to grow additional crops, but so the farming systems are going to be different. And if you try to impose a technology on producers that doesn't work for them, you're not going to be very unsuccessful. So you actually have to get them involved from the beginning in the innovation and keep them involved. But that's incentives. And the second part is, I think Tim McAllister said it as well, we need incentives. If producers are going to be driven by economics, and they're not afraid to innovate. Producers, OECD measure of innovation is where their firm does one thing different in a given year, then they've innovated that year. Farmers do 10 things different every year. They innovate very quickly. So they can adapt, and they will adapt, but they need an incentive to do that as well. So I think it's important to put that together.
So interestingly enough, Marty in our audience has really picked up on this too. And I kind of want to cycle the next part of that question back to Tim Searchinger, because he asks about your concept of formulating teams, and he's acknowledging that that's a really interesting idea, but he's asking about the governance structure that you might see working best for that, and really who leads the team, who organizes it, who provides the overarching structure for that from an agri-food perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess it would, to some extent, it varies right by the sector. I mean, to me, the way I've contemplated it in Denmark is there is a partnership that's part government, part researchers, and part farmers or farm organizations, and has a target to say, well, our target is going to be to reduce emissions from manure in pig production, let's say, by X amount. And it identifies the series of potential technological options. It looks at the different types of farms, deals with the practical challenges. It says, okay, we're going to try out these things, we're going to try out those things, and works on them together. So I think in that way, ultimately, at some level, we're assigned governments the responsibility to reduce emissions. So they have to be responsible for that, but obviously they want to create teams that are going to work. So I think it maybe is some way or other, it's a partnership, and then you have leaders, and the leaders from each sector, I would say, government, research, and farming community, maybe a couple from the farming community in different parts, and for each team. And I would say that, but then you assemble more. But I would say something like that.
Interesting. So I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, Tim, because you're our representative American in the crowd. And we've had a couple of questions that have come in that have said, Canada's been doing some pretty amazing things. I mean, the work that Tim showed us, then the data that Richard showed us, showed that Canada's doing pretty well in terms of emission reductions. So is there a need for more emission reductions in Canada? Obviously, we're working hard at accomplishing that goal. Or should we be taking a North American strategy? What do you think?
So I think you'd probably find that the emissions in the US have also been going down per unit of production. And they're, to a fair extent, a corollary of all the things that Tim McAllister was saying, this kind of increased feeding efficiency in livestock production. And in a way, thank God, right? If it weren't for those efficiency gains, if it weren't for yield gains, you know, we already wouldn't have any forests left in the world. The challenge we have is it's such a big challenge. You kind of can't rest on your laurels. I mean, as I said, it's not just the population growing to 10 billion people, but the thing, and I noticed that one of the questions somebody asked about, is it really going to be the case that we're going to have this large increase in meat consumption? And what a lot of people don't realize, I think I could actually maybe show a slide here for a second, is, here, I'll show this slide. And what people don't, let's see, review from slideshow from current slide. Where play for, oh, anyway, I don't know, it's not coming. Oh, wait, it doesn't show me the current slide, but anyway, you can see this. And what you see is the red is existing consumption of animal products. And you can see that we in the US, Canada, European Union, we're way, way up here. And then, and this is the population that's going to be in 10 billion. And this is the consumption by those people in the red. And you can see that 60% of those people consume significantly less than half, most a quarter of our animal products. That includes milk, by the way. And so what happens is these people begin to consume even half of our animal products. You have this massive increase in demand. You have this 60% of the world that consumes very, very little. And even by going up to half, you're going to get this increased demand. So the challenge is that this is just a huge amount of food, right? I mean, it takes a lot more resources to produce animal products, no matter how efficiently we do it. And so we have to get even more and more efficient. We're going to have more beef, and Canada's beef sector should continue to produce beef, but we can't afford to have an 80% increase in beef consumption. We need to keep that lower, which means we probably will have a bigger increase. We may have an 80% increase in dairy consumption, which is a lot more efficient. And so this is the challenge we have. So the basic story is, yeah, people are doing well from a greenhouse gas perspective, but we just have to do even phenomenally better. And then there are things, we could do better. I mean, as I said, let's stop converting, grasslands. So basically that's it. I would say it's just a huge challenge.
Okay, so if we just take that, and I'm looking at you, Tim McAllister, and we take that and we add on the next layer to that question. If we have this massive and growing demand, what is our actual capacity? Can you speculate what the capacity in the beef sector in Alberta might be? I mean, I drive past Okotoks and it just looks like wall-to-wall beef to me, but how much bigger can it get?
Yeah, well, I think there's room for some expansion, but when we look at if we're losing our grass, I emphasize the integrated nature of Canada's beef cattle production system. And if we lose more grasslands, that's going to increase our pressure on the cow-calf sector. And as was mentioned, we also have the inevitable occurrence of winter to deal with, where basically there's not very much photosynthesis going on, capturing carbon at all. And we need to have the expenses of preservation of feed to maintain those herds over the winter time as well. So all of those, make us less efficient relative to more southern climates like Brazil, where they can graze cattle year round. So we need to consider those kinds of factors. But, the other thing is, like with our intensification, our integrated system is really important for the maintenance of the herds that we already have. We couldn't maintain the cattle herd that we have now if we went to an entirely grass-based system, because the feedlots represent such an improvement in efficiency and production. And, and also we compete in terms of exports in the high-end market. And one of the reasons why we can produce such high-quality beef is because of that use of the feedlot system as well. So we need to think of those things. But the other thing I think we need to, which is always difficult to sell, is that we need to take a global perspective. Ultimately, we want to lower greenhouse gas emissions on a global perspective. One country doing something while other countries don't do anything is not going to help anybody. So if we're taking that approach and we're looking at food, then we need to identify those regions in the world where that food can be produced most efficiently, and that's where that needs to be integrated into the overall food production system for humanity. And Canada is in a good position, as I indicated, from an efficiency perspective because of the technologies in that we're using in the system and the intensification. And I think that's Tim also made the point about having that intensive areas of livestock production while preserving other more extensive systems for parks and for grasslands and biodiversity, et cetera. And I think that that's an important approach to take, not only in Canada but globally as well.
And if I could just build on that, because this is the thing, when I talk about the fact that we need to hold down our beef consumption, so we're in favor of kind of Americans reducing their beef consumption, but that's because 80% of the world eats almost no beef. And as they eat more beef, they're going to need more beef. And there is only probably so much capacity to increase. So it is quite compatible to have a position that says, that kind of celebrates good beef production where it occurs and says it should continue to occur, and to say we need to have dietary modifications so that we create room for these billions of people in the world who consume virtually no beef to eat a little bit of beef. And so that's the thing. It's not all or nothing. It's not getting rid of beef. It's holding down the growth globally so that we can, basically fit it in.
Right, sure. Richard, you had made a lot of comments about increasing the production intensity or the yield without added nitrogen, and talking about the improvements that you've seen there. I love the numbers you drew from your own personal home farm. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, a couple things, I guess. Certainly in crop production, there's genetic increase in yields. Then crop breeding is basically achieving between 0.5% and 1% a year just through better genetics. And I think we can probably ramp that up in the future. Agronomics has played a big role in this. Certainly the introduction of pulses into a rotation not only is a break, if you like, it's nitrogen, a crop that doesn't require added nitrogen, produces its own, leaves a little bit behind, but mainly it also breaks up disease and other things in those. So it's a very powerful thing. So I think there is potential, and certainly even within how we apply nitrogen fertilizer, when we apply it, those types of things can all be done. So we can do some of that as well. Before we leave that, I'd like to just comment a bit on the protein. I've been doing some work looking at the demand for pea protein, and they can now process pea protein is now recognized because of its amino acid profile is actually being a preferred protein by bodybuilders for building up body mass. And no one would have said that 30 years ago. But now the protein technologies, I think, are really important. And if we can actually figure out how to make vegetable protein a desirable thing for people to purchase, it has to taste good, obviously, but it also has to create the growth and the strength and the other things that people want from protein. But I think we're on our way to do that as well. But we need to continue innovating in that sense. People are not going to switch to out of vegetable protein and consume less beef. By the way, I agree with both comments. We're not going to run short of any kind of beef demand in the near future. So we can do both. But I think it is really important that we develop plant proteins in a form that people will demand. And I think with a bit of breeding and a bit of technology, those can be actually superior proteins, or at least equal to the proteins you would get from animal sources. So I think it's important to do that.
Sure, and it definitely fills some of that gap for the global population. I do want to go back to a question about nitrogen, because Tim made such an important point that go to where the emissions are and deal with those. And Dr. Searchener, you talked a little bit about reducing emissions from nitrous oxide. And you mentioned about using different types of fertilizer, and I just because I was doing some advanced reading of work that you've done, I know you've done some interesting work in different types of fertilizers, and one of our audience members picked that up too, and asked if you could speak a little bit more on the innovation in types of fertilizers and what that means for nitrous oxide releases.
Yeah, well, two things. So one, we've had for a while nitrification inhibitors. So nitrous oxide comes from when nitrogen turns into nitrate, and then nitrate breaks down, and in the course of that, it's denitrified, you release some nitrous oxide. And a lot of, not all, I'm not exactly sure what fertilizers are being used throughout Canada, but a lot of fertilizer are applied in ammonium form. And then the question is, can you keep it as ammonium longer and therefore reduce the amount that becomes nitrous oxide? And so there are things called nitrification inhibitors that do that. They've been around for a long time, but they've had amazing little work. There's like no new ones. No one's really working on them, and people are doing them for a few weeks. You know, one obvious thing that could be done is to combine those with compounds to hold it in longer, so that instead of just lasting for 4 weeks, it might last for 12 weeks, and then you can have the right balance of ammonium or a greater balance. Now, by the way, there's there's 50 years of research that has found that if you could have more of the nitrogen remain as ammonium, so it's still going to be mostly nitrate, but if more of it could remain as ammonium, which is good for the environment, you can also get yield gains. Mm-hmm. And that probably varies by crop. So I have an article that's kind of in review where we're basically advocating for this joint effort to simultaneously try to find ways to keep more nitrogen in the form of ammonium and use it to identify those crop varieties that actually have a much higher yield. And sometimes like 40, 50% higher. I mean, really big yields. And this is because crops use different systems to use nitrate and ammonium. And it looks like, and sometimes they kind of saturate what they can do with nitrate. And if they have ammonium at that time, they can do better. So there's a bunch of scientists. I'm not one of them, but I'm kind of a fan of them. My job is to be a fan, who identified a natural property of tropical grasses that puts out a kind of a natural nitrification inhibitor, keeps nitrogen in the soils more as ammonium. And that was because they wanted to keep it from running off. And they have now identified varieties of wheat wild varieties of wheat that they've now interbred with high yield varieties that have this nitrification inhibition property to them. And so there's a possibility of simultaneously reducing the nitrous oxide by keeping more nitrogen in the form of ammonium and boosting the yields. So that's very exciting. And just to give you some idea, the research budget for that global effort is about $1 million a year. I mean, these are people. I mean, this is one of the really big options, and it's got no money. You know, it's being carried on in kind of the spare time of most of the researchers, you know, in the system. And so that's just an example of where maybe it won't pan out as wonderfully as I hope it will, but it's one of these really big ideas. And to spend $1 million on that, it's crazy. We'd be spending $1 billion on that. I mean, you know, if we're going to solve climate change, given all these challenges and boost yields, you know, we should be taking every idea that's a good idea and really pursuing it to the max.
Boy, are you ever speaking to the choir over here. I really appreciate that comment, Tim. And so I'm going to turn it back to all three of you, and just in your own time, if you could make some comments about how and where you think policy could best help us to advance the innovations, and what things we need to be focusing on most as we take these ideas forward. And Richard, I'm going to start with you this time, if you don't mind, please.
Sure. I guess I would say and I'm going to talk mainly for the crop sector, But I do think we need a lot more research that goes into agronomics than we currently are. It's the idea somehow that that's privately supplied and we don't need research, but I think the opposite is actually true. I think we need a lot more agronomic research. As these farming systems change, we need the research that can support those. And I would also throw breeding to there. We have a $10 billion crop industry in a bad year, and I know all the breeders in Canada. It's not a very big group, and I'm always struck by how little investment there actually is in these very, very proven ways to increase productivity and improve efficiency and improve that sequestration that we actually need to sustain ourselves and to get out of this carbon mess we're in. So I think those are the two areas. And I guess I would say on the agronomic side, we have to figure out how to get producers in charge or in charge of that. Involved or in charge of that type of research. The government can help fund it, but I think producers are the ones that are going to have to use the technology and have the best questions. I think they're the ones that are going to push it ahead.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass over to Tim McAllister, because we both know how difficult it is to get funding for livestock research. Same sort of challenge.
Yeah, it can be a challenge for sure. I think I've already talked a little bit about how I think we need to increase our recognized value in our grassland ecosystems and the role that they play both in Canada's beef cattle production, the ability to produce food from those lands, and then that, the precision, what I would call precision land use change. So that involves growing crops in those areas that are most amendable, both from the perspective of nutrient profile and water availability in order to grow those crops, and preserving those regions as grasslands, not putting marginal lands into crop production, because that's probably going to be a lose-lose for all that are involved in the long run. I think we also need to continue the research in the additives and the technologies, whether we talk about precision nutrition. There's a lot of electronic gadgetry that's coming available now that enables us to make physiological measurements and monitor animals in a manner that was previously impossible. So I think those can really be insights into formulating diets for the individual. I think it doesn't matter if we're talking about livestock or crops or different areas of land. We're really talking about getting increased precision so that we're matching nutrient needs with nutrient availability in both livestock and crop systems. And the more precisely we can do that down to the individual animal or the individual plant, the better off we'll probably be in that perspective as well. The other component I think that needs to be added into that, though, is, I often get asked the question when I show that improvements we've had over the 1981 to 2011, whether we expect that percentage improvements to increase or continue in the future. And a big part of that is going to be the adoption of these technologies. And as part of that is a regulatory component as well. We just can't run out and grab a technology and throw it into a production system. There's a regulatory procedure that we need to follow. That's going on now. The CRISPR-Cas was mentioned. There's a debate going on whether that represents genetic modification or not, and the whole issue that we've already experienced with GMOs. I think we need to take a different perspective from a regulatory standpoint, not only from the regulators themselves, but from society as a whole, if we're going to meet the objectives of producing the amount of food that we're going to require in the future. And then the final area that I think that livestock could play a real big area is in the whole area of surplus food and food waste and food loss. If we look at the investment that goes in, and upwards of 30 to 50% of the food that's produced is actually wasted, depending upon where you are in the world. That really represents food in which all of the investment in terms of economic investment, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, and then a large portion of that food is ending up in a landfill where it further produces additional greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of lowering the footprint in food production, that's probably one of our biggest wins if we can lower that surplus food that we're dealing with now in the food production system. And livestock can play a big role in that, because a large portion of that surplus food is of a fibrous nature, which makes it ideal for inclusion in the diets of livestock, particularly cattle. But there are some regulatory issues that have to be looked at as well. For example, it's illegal to feed banana peels in Canada because banana peels are not on the Feeds Act stage 4 list of approved feed ingredients. So now you need to have an experimental study certificate if you want to feed banana peels in Canada. So I think we need to look at some of those regulatory aspects as well and adjust them in a manner that will help us meet the food needs of the world.
Very insightful. Thank you so much, Tim. I never knew that about banana peels. Add that to my list of things I've learned today. And gentlemen, we're getting very close to the end. So Dr. Searchner, I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes, and then we'll be at the end of our question and answers. Thank you.
I think the only thing I'll do is I'll expand a little bit on this point about how we value land as a carbon asset. So imagine we had a perfect carbon pricing system in the world, and everyone who emitted a ton of carbon had to pay a price, $20, whatever, per ton. Everyone who planted a tree would be paid for a ton absorbed. And in that situation, it would be very expensive to clear land, so people wouldn't do it. People might be tempted to plant trees on some agricultural land to get that price. And that would then, because we still need all the food, it would create enormous financial incentives to produce more food on the same land. And now we're not going to do that. There are all kinds of practical reasons we're not going to do that. There are all kinds of political reasons we're not going to have this perfect system. But what it means is that every acre of land that can grow a tree has a value growing a tree, which means if we don't use it for that, we better damn well use it well. And so that's a guide to the way we think about our strategies. We need to have policies that create the same incentives that we would create if we in fact had that kind of perfect pricing system. So that means you are valued for producing more food on the same land and more efficiently, and that's part of the system, and you are penalized for clearing land. So we need to kind of imitate that even in an imperfect system.
Awesome. And thank you for your final comment. I really appreciate it. It's been a really interesting morning, and my job is now complete, and I'm passing it back over to Tyler.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to the panelists. Merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. J'espère que vous avez aimé les présentations et les discussions et appris autant que moi. I would like to thank our panelists and our moderator, Susan Wood-Bohm, for their valuable insights. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's webinar, AgWest Bio and the Global Institute for Food Security. We hope to see you on day 2 of this webinar series on Friday, March 5th from 11 to 12:30 Eastern, moderated by David Diziak with panelists Brian McConkey, Ann Wasco, and Sarah Fedorchuk. A link to register for day 2 and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to all participants following the event. The work that the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute undertakes is possible because of funders who believe in advancing the agriculture and agri-food sector like you. There are many different ways to support the work of the Institute, as seen listed here, and we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. Please reach out to explore the different funding opportunities through the info email located at the bottom right of the screen. We look forward to connecting to you and to seeing you on Friday. Thank you very much and have a great day.